In terms of religion, it doesn't allow the government to declare a national religion. So, you Christian nationalists out there that's trying to make the entire country Christian and white, y'all need to stop. The U.S. Constitution does not agree with you. Get a life. One thing I will say is I'll never advocate for the fact that the government should be allowed to take guns, and the Second Amendment clearly indicates that the government will never be allowed to do this. But I do think this question and the conversation should be had in is where is the line? That's how we put it. Where's the line? The ability to understand that, hey, there are more rights in here that I get right now. It's so valuable, it's so important, and constantly evolving Constitution. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Purple Political Podcast, and I am your host, Riddell Lewis. How you doing? Hope you're doing well. And today we're going to be talking about the Bill of Rights. I'm going to break it down. I'm going to go over what it says, go over what it means, and then I'm going to wrap it up by doing a top, well, more so a ranking from 10 to 1 on which amendments I think are better than others. So that is for the end. So if you want to see that ranking, stay tuned for the end of the episode. And as always, we're going to start off the episode by reading off a review. So if you want to get shouted out in the episode, let me hear what you got to say. Make sure you leave a review in Apple Podcast, or you can leave a review on Spotify too if you just want to leave a 5-star review. I would appreciate it. So from it seems like from Katie Brinkley, they said, enjoy this new news show. It's great to hear the latest news and then commentary and opinions about what is happening. I don't necessarily agree with everything, but that is the joy of hearing other perspectives. And no problem. I have my own opinions, but at the very least, the point of this show is to kind of go over things that are going on, go over important issues, help inform the people, and have good conversations. That is what this podcast is about. That's what it will continuously be about. And, hey, some clickbait here and there, but that clickbait is important clickbait, so don't worry about it. So let's go over the Bill of Rights. Let's just dive right into it, and we're going to go in order from the First Amendment to the 10th Amendment. So I'm going to start off by reading what it says in the Constitution itself. So the First Amendment indicates, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So there's a lot of layers to the First Amendment, and this is kind of the crux of the American way of life, the individual rights that people get, that people have. In terms of religion, it doesn't allow the government to declare a national religion. So you Christian nationalists out there that's trying to make the entire country Christian and white, y'all need to stop. The U.S. Constitution does not agree with you, and get a life. You feel me? Get a life. That's not what America's about. That's not the U.S. Constitution way. It literally says it in the First Amendment. Read your scripture, feel me? Your scripture. It also says it doesn't favor one religion over the other. So, even though we're a mostly Christian nation, we're definitely kind of letting in more and more religions, such as the Muslim faith, the Islam faith, Jewish faith has always been here, but you know what I'm talking about. So, at the end of the day, government is not allowed to favor one Christian over the other. Now, things to keep in mind, it does say this. There's a lot more nuance to a lot of these amendments, by the way. It does say this, but they do allow like blue laws, which is basically laws that allow for missing work because of a holiday, certain stipulations for, Sunday, Christmas, Christian church Sunday, for example, right? You know how like Chick-fil-A, they don't, work on Sundays, for example. And there's a most recent lawsuit, actually, kind of tie into current news. There's a recent lawsuit that is going on in reference to someone who works for USPS, I believe, or at the very least, they work for a delivery service, and they were denied the ability to go to church on Sunday. The employer basically was like, we can't let you go to church because, we'll be leaving a hole if you go and you're not here. So he's filing a lawsuit against the company for not allowing him to express his religious freedom in this situation. More than likely, he'll win this stipulation, and the courts and the lawyers are also indicating that moving forward, if an employer doesn't outright indicate a absolute need and necessity for someone to work and denying their religious right, because there is a law put in place or there's a stipulation put in place that if the company absolutely needs it, then they can deny that religious, blue law right that I was just listening earlier. So if they cannot establish that necessity, then this lawsuit would definitely go forward. So definitely keep that in mind if you have a religious right that you adhere to. And don't like take advantage of it. You can't one of these days go like, "Hey man, I'm Jewish. Hanukkah's here. I'm not going to school." Yeah, we can't do that, right? But at the very least, you need to know your religious right, especially for these employers. Places like Amazon tries to screw people over all the time. So you got to know what you're handling. This guy's probably going to win his lawsuit, going to win millions of dollars because he knew his rights, he wanted to practice it, and now moving forward, he probably will never have to work a day in his life again. You feel me? Just know this, of course. Also, the aspect of expressing your freedom of speech. So that's pretty, self-explanatory. That's really just giving you the ability to say what's on your mind for the most part without any, government interference or regulation on what you're saying. You can never be held liable to content that you say or opinion you say about someone that is true and factual. Now, the caveat to this is if you start saying defamation stuff, if you start saying things that disrupt the peace, for example, you're in a movie theater and say fire and cause a riot or whatever, or say stuff that's content neutral but can definitely be perceived different ways, that doesn't necessarily hold nearly as valid in comparison to just truthful and factual information and in terms of freedom of speech. So you got to know the differences when you're kind of saying things for people. But if you're saying the facts, if you got the facts, you got to prove it, of course, then, hey, man, the freedom of speech is right there. And the freedom of speech and hate speech is definitely a very interesting conversation nowadays with people trying to implement things of hate speech in the U.S. kind of laws, right? I believe maybe in Europe or Canada, I forget which country versus which country in Europe is trying to implement hate laws into such an extent that if you say something on social media, they can actually find you and you can get a criminal charge. So I don't think the America will ever go that far, but they're definitely kind of taking steps with the internet and how you can kind of say anything with kind of full anonymity. One thing I will say in terms of the freedom of speech is like you could say anything, but you gotta hold steadfast on what you're saying, right? I don't know if I'll necessarily mind, and you can let me know if you agree with this. I don't know if I necessarily mind if people are held accountable, or at the very least, pointed out in the things they are saying. I really don't like when people just say things anonymously, and then are not held accountable. Like, if I'm on a Call of Duty lobby and someone calls me the N word, for the most part, I really don't care, but like, I want to know who's saying it, right? I want to know the person who's saying it. Because we got to realize, I think we all know this nowadays, is that a lot of people will say things on the internet that they will never say in your face, right? So if someone's going to say something and they're going to say it in my face, then I can confront the person. I won't get violent. I never think it's okay to get violent just because someone calls you the N word or whatever, right? I won't get violent. I'll just laugh in his face. I will laugh in his face. You gotta give me the right to laugh in his face. Come on now. I deserve that right. So definitely keep that in mind. Also, it talks about peaceful protest. You know, peaceful, peaceful protest. So riots are not peaceful, by the way. So the First Amendment does not give you the right to be violent. Just saying. Peaceful protest gives you the right to, assembly, It doesn't give you the right to social like association though. So like criminal organizations, gangs, all that stuff. They ain't cool with that necessarily, but just keep that in mind. And the right to petition, of course, if you're a government or if your employer or school or whatever. Um, in my neighborhood, they put a racquetball court instead of a basketball court. So I have the right to petition the fact that, hey man, I know that there's mostly white people in my neighborhood, but like, come on, man, I want a ball, bro. I don't want to play racquetball. Okay, come on. Who wants to play racquetball? Nobody wants to play racquetball. I want to ball. So, hey, this is a perfect example of me petitioning. Now, will the petition be successful? No, because I am very few in terms of colored individuals in this neighborhood. You know what I'm saying? So, I probably would lose that petition, but I have the right to do it. So keep that in mind. Keep in mind your First Amendment rights, all that very important stuff, of course. But there is nuance, there's caveats to each and every one of them. It doesn't give you the right to do whatever you want. Always keep that in mind. It doesn't give you the right to do whatever you want. Now we got the Second Amendment, of course. This is a lot more, detailed. This is probably going to be the most talking I want to give over one particular amendment for a good reason, because there's so much conversation, there's so much deliberation between the Second Amendment. And it really starts on what it actually even means, okay? So, the Second Amendment, a well regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, you would assume the Second Amendment just says, hey, you can have a gun whenever the frick you want, right? So it doesn't say that. And because it doesn't say that, there's actually two interpretations of this amendment: the individual right theory and the collective rights theory. Now, the individual right theory basically indicates focusing on the individual and focuses on the fact that each individual should have the right to possess a firearm. And it prohibits the government from prohibiting them from possessing a firearm. So that's basically the entire idea, that kind of the common idea of the Second Amendment nowadays, is that people should have the right to have a gun to protect themselves, right? As for the collective rights theory, that's basically kind of a different approach to what it means, and it focuses on the idea that state governments should have the right to protect themselves against the federal government, but it does not give citizens these individual rights to have guns. So basically, the idea is that the state government, anytime the federal government wants to do some weird stuff, they have the right to, formulate their own way of protecting themselves and the people of the state against the federal government, right? So there are two different interpretations of what it is. Now, I'm going to go over a lot of different cases, and the reason why I want to do that is kind of try to figure out or kind of really illustrate how the interpretation of the Second Amendment has been changing for so long. And this is just a broad overview. Maybe one day I'll do a full podcast episode purely in talking about what the heck the Second Amendment actually means. But this is a broad overview for people to kind of understand the Second Amendment a little bit better, okay? So in 1939, the United States versus Miller, which is the case law, in this situation, it indicated that Congress could regulate a sawed-off shotgun because they don't believe it has some reasonable relationship to the preservation or efficiency of a well-regulated militia. The court then explained that the framers included the Second Amendment, the original people who created it. Come on, James Madison, you know what a framer is. To ensure the effectiveness of the military. So initially in 1939, they started to make a stipulation with certain guns like, hey, this probably is not going to help you in this situation. We do not need sawed-off shotguns. It's probably more dangerous than helpful in terms of protection at the end of the day, right? Moving forward in the future, in 2008, District Columbia v. Heller, the plaintiff in Heller, challenged the constitutionality of a Washington, D.C. law which prohibited the possession of handguns. In a 5-4 decision, the court struck down the D.C. handgun ban as violative of that right. The court meticulously detailed the history and tradition of the Second Amendment at the time of the Constitutional Convention and proclaimed that the Second Amendment established an individual right for U.S. citizens to possess firearms. So right in this case, it definitely is starting to establish the kind of current modern proclamation of what the Second Amendment is and that's the individual use of possessing a firearm. It really is definitely started diving into the individual right theory. The court carved out Miller as an exception to the general rule that Americans may possess firearms, claiming that law abiding citizens cannot use sawed off shotguns for any law abiding purposes. So it kind of reinforced the kind of sawed off shotgun stuff. Similarly, the court in dicta stated that firearm regulations would not implicate the Second Amendment if that weaponry cannot be used for law abiding purposes. So this kind of establishes the idea that certain guns are not necessary. We do not need bazookas, ladies and gentlemen. That is not necessary. Further, the court suggested that the United States Constitution would not disallow regulations prohibiting criminals and the mentally ill from firearm possession. So this is definitely an interesting one because the conversation of should criminals and should the mentally ill have firearm possessions nowadays is very interesting. In 2010, McDonald versus City of Chicago also went over the idea of, Chicago banning handguns and the case law regarding that. In 2022, which is kind of the most recent thing that happened in terms of this stuff, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin. In Bruin, the court struck down a New York law requiring parties interested in purchasing a handgun for the use. This is going to be very long-winded, so bear with me. If my voice soothes you, then we're all on the same page. And purchasing a handgun for the use of self-defense outside of the home to obtain a license because the law issued licenses on a may issue rather than a shall issue basis. This may issue licensing method allowed state authorities to deny interested parties public use license for firearms if the interested party was unable to show proper cause as to why they have a heightened need for self-protection over the general population. So in this situation, if you don't really understand it, the idea is definitely whether or not there's a real need basis for someone to have a gun in public, right? Do they need to protect themselves so much that they may endanger the rest of the people in that situation? That's the question, right? Furthermore, the court disavowed the use of means and tests many jurisdictions had adopted for the purposes of interpreting the Second Amendment, instead ruling that a Second Amendment analysis is limited to evaluating the historical nature of the right and whether a given use of a firearm or other weapon is deeply rooted in the history of the United States. Post-Buren, courts can no longer use a standard scrutiny analysis like the one seen in Kachowski v. County of Westchester to determine if a gun regulation is constitutional. No. Instead, a government wishing to place restrictions on firearm ownership must affirmatively prove that its firearm regulation is part of the historical tradition that delimits the outer bounds of the right to keep and bear arms. In a concurrence, Justice Kavanaugh, joined by Justice Roberts, emphasizes that Bruin is not intended to invalidate shall issue licensing structures or other restrictions on firearm ownership, including fingerprinting, background checks, mental health evaluations, mandatory training requirements, and potential other requirements. Additionally, this concurrence draws a line between objective gun control measures, where an individual must pass a set of predetermined requirements which are constitutional, and subjective gun control measures such as licensing at a state official's discretion, which are not. Some other stuff I left out, but kind of that's the important stuff in this situation, right? So at the end of the day, especially currently in 2023, the interpretation of carrying a gun has changed dramatically from the initial idea of what it was meant to what it was meant to be. The initial idea was that people should have the means to protect themselves against the government. And sure, that's still a common idea of why people should carry guns. But the pure idea of it is having that means. Now, it's either an individual means or a state means. Regardless, the only idea of the Second Amendment is being able to fight against your government in lieu of them potentially becoming some type of dictatorship or kind of authoritarian government, situation, right? So that was the initial purpose of the Second Amendment. Now, the idea of the Second Amendment has definitely changed a lot since that initial idea, as it was becoming more and more prevalent that people were focusing on the idea of having an individual right to have a gun to protect themselves just cause, right? So having the ability to protect yourselves with a gun individually is kind of now the foremost purpose of the Second Amendment. I want to have a gun. Sure, it might be able to protect themselves, but I have to just protect myself in general, right? It went from protecting myself against the federal government to protect myself every single day in every single situation that may occur. So it changed quite a bit in that situation. Whether that's good or bad, it's up for your own interpretation, of course. And now we're moving into a situation where even all the kind of shall issue structures that was indicated in reference to post Buren is becoming a afterthought, right? Because now the majority of states in the United States are permitless carries. And I'm going to do a whole podcast episode in reference to whether this is a smart thing or not, basically. And I want to go in a lot of different perspectives. I'm going to dive into the research and dive into the data to kind of see, does this even make sense? So we went from being able to use certain guns to protect ourselves to going against the government to having a gun and protecting ourselves in every situation as an individual, and went from beyond even the home to in public to the point where we don't need any kind of stipulation on why or how or any training or reference to you having a gun. Anybody in any situation can have a gun and obviously only use it to protect themselves, of course, but any situation can allow a person to have a gun. Even a criminal and mentally ill, they don't need to have a background check or anything like that. Now, there is, when you buy a gun in some states, even though it's permitless carry, sometimes you still do have to do a background check to see if you're a criminal or mentally ill or whatever. But regardless, the idea that currently that in a lot of states anybody can have a gun in any situation is a very interesting circumstance. And will it become a nationwide thing? Very unlikely. But it's interesting how we're becoming looser and looser on our opinion of using and having a gun. It's very interesting in that situation. I don't really know why people love guns so much, but I understand the guns can be fun. I used to be in the military. I fired a lot of guns too. But at the end of the day, it's a very interesting question to have. It's a very interesting discussion to have. Sure, gun violence has increased. Mass shootings have increased. But even in those situations, because I want to provide nuance in these conversations, even in those instances, the question of how easy they got the gun can be asked for sure. But we also have to realize that in this generation currently, more and more people are becoming depressed, suicidal, unwell, influenced by more and more things, and becoming more and more kind of unhinged. Mental illness is becoming more and more of a thing. People taking pills and drugs is becoming more and more of a thing, right? So it's more than, the opinions of using a gun becoming lax. It's also the aspect of people and their mindset kind of changing in terms of their mental stability in this era versus prior ones. So there's a lot of perspectives and nuances. One thing I will say is I'll never advocate for the fact that the government should be allowed to take guns, and the Second Amendment clearly indicates that the government will never be allowed to do this. But I do think the question and the conversation should be had where's the line? That's how I'm going to put it. Where's the line? Now let's go over the Third Amendment. Third Amendment says, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. But very straightforward in what this says. Basically, the military personnel are not allowed to force themselves in your home, and that's just not okay. Very simple. We don't really have issues with this, especially since there's really never a time where foreign invaders come to the United States. They don't want that smoke, you feel me? So this is a pretty straightforward amendment, right? We understand. I think we all understand. Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So search and seizure, I think we all kind of realize this, and it's very interesting nowadays in terms of like how TikTok and virality and videos and clips and having videos on taking videos on your phone has really kind of shed light on the importance of this issue, right? Not allowing cops to do whatever they want in different circumstances, right? Law and order SVU makes you think that, hey, they are good all the time, but sometimes cops can be very inappropriate and definitely should get punished in those circumstances. With that said, there are things to consider in reference to this amendment. Uh, for instance, a warrantless search may be lawful if an officer has asked and given consent to search. So if they ask if they can come in and you say yes, then they have every right to come in and search, right? The search is incident to a lawful arrest. So if they know in this circumstantially, but if they know that the arrest needs to happen, then arrest needs to happen. They have to prove this though. They have to prove this, of course, and there has to be it needs to be apparent. If there's probable cause to search and there's exigent circumstance calling for the warrantless search, I guess very strict circumstances. Exigent circumstances exist in situation where people are in imminent danger, where evidence faces imminent destruction or prior to a suspect's imminent escape. If a person's about to run away, if a person is in danger, got a gun to someone's face, stuff like that, right? I think we understand it. So we know how this stuff works, but there are caveats to how the amendment works as well. The three things I listed to you are perfect examples. As for seizure, this is another very important thing in terms of comps and making sure you know your rights, right? These are important to knowing your rights. A seizure of a person within the meaning of the Fourth Amendment occurs when the police's conduct will communicate to a reasonable person, taking into account the circumstances surrounding the encounter, that the person, listen up, that the person is not free to ignore the police presence and leave at his will. So they can't just do whatever they want with you, but you can't just ignore the police and leave the scene, right? The moment you do that, then they're going to act, right? So you always have to listen. I know it's annoying. I agree, it's annoying, especially when you haven't done anything wrong. Listen, do what they say, know your rights, stay steadfast, and wait for them to leave. That's really your only options in that situation, right? Because at the end of the day, the police, I want to put things in perspective. The police have a job, and there are good cops out there. They have a job. They're here to do their job. Sometimes they're told something from a Karen. You got to think, if a Karen goes like, hey, yo, this guy's a criminal, they only know from the perspective of the Karen that they said you're a criminal, right? So they're there to do their job. They have to be in their wits' end. They have to be aware of their own safety, right? So you got to keep things in mind. Just do what you got to do. Get your phone out. Usually I'm not with the whole thing of, hey, every time something happens, get your phone out. But in your situation where, your life might be in danger, where it's a really annoying circumstance with a cop, get your phone out, videotape, follow their instructions, and know your rights. That's what's important. Time to go over the Fifth Amendment. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger, nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. I'm not caught up in my old style American English, lingo and linguistics. Nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So a lot of things right there. I'm going to break down the five most important things to get out of from what was just said. The right to indictment by the grand jury before any criminal charges for felonious crimes, right? You always have a right to a grand jury in those situations. A prohibition on double jeopardy. This is basically the idea is that they cannot keep charging you for the same crime. That is not okay, right? That's not okay. A right against forced self-incrimination. This is basically the idea is that you can, have a right to an attorney. Those situations where they want you to say certain things and trying to force you to say certain things so you incriminate yourself. You can just keep quiet. You don't have to say a single thing. You can just keep quiet. A guarantee that all criminal defendants have a fair trial, and that's pretty simple. They have the right to due process in that situation. You can't be corrupt and make it against them. You know what I'm saying? And a guarantee that the government cannot seize private property without compensating you with the market value of the property. So the government can't come and just take your land. They can't do that. You feel me? So you gotta, if you have land, make sure you know your Fifth Amendment rights. So important stuff right there. Very simple in terms of the 5 stipulations. Know your rights. Sixth Amendment. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial, but an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witness against them, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and have the assistance of counsel for his defense, right? So in this situation, there's a few things to kind of pull out. This is the rights of a criminal defendant, even though that, they may be a criminal, a lot of evidence is indicating them as such, maybe. Everyone under American law has rights, even criminals, especially in trial. So they have the right to a public trial without unnecessary delay, the right to a lawyer, the right to an impartial jury, and to the right to know who your accusers are and the nature of the charges and evidence against you. They have the right to know all this. Now, know this stuff. Bring out, hey man, Sixth Amendment right. Tell me what I'm charged for. If you're about to get ascertained, right to a lawyer. Of course, it really gets starting getting tough with public figures, like Deshaun Watson. You have to find jurors who know nothing about who you are, right? So all this stuff is important to know, important to consider, and always, know your rights. Seventh Amendment. In suits at common law where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. So this is basically trying to distinguish, civil claims versus like criminal ones. So, sometimes you just don't need a jury. Sometimes you could just do it with the judge alone. Situation, for example, with Judge Judy. Those Judge Judy ones are the ones where, talk to the judge and then kind of handle it there. If you get like a traffic violation, for example. So it really just indicates that, hey, smaller situations, civil situations, you don't need a huge jury. You can just do it with the judge alone. Kind of distinguishing the two. The Eighth Amendment. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. This is for the criminals, right? It's very interesting how many of the first 10 amendments is about like justice, basically, law and justice. So basically the idea here is the judge or whoever, the jury or whatever, the cop, who are they called? I forget what they're called. The security in prisons. They have a specific name. I just forget. Correctional officers, I believe. They are not allowed to torture a prisoner. They're not allowed to, give a death penalty to someone who doesn't deserve it. Just like, for example, if someone was jaywalking, they don't deserve the death penalty. That's excessive, right? Excessive bail, some situation where they stole $20 of candy and go like, hey, bail is set at $500,000, for example, right? So in those situations, this is to kind of protect against that. The question on cruel and unusual punishment is definitely a conversation nowadays, especially for human rights activists, because, the American prison system, although I don't think it's the worst in the world, definitely has its flaws, of course. And the question of like, someone who's on drugs, do they deserve like this, huge prison situation. The mentally ill, do they deserve to go to prison, for example? So there, even like with the death penalty, like does anybody deserve to die, for example? So there's a lot of nuance and conversation around what this cruel, unusual punishment actually means. So that's a conversation for another day, right? Ninth Amendment. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be constructed or construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So this basically means that James Madison put this amendment there to basically say, hey, yo, just because it's not in the Constitution doesn't mean that there's other rights that are implied or implicitly said by, certain standards that you don't have as well. Just because I forgot to write it in the first 10 Bill of Rights doesn't mean that it can't be added or doesn't mean that you don't have it in the future, right? So it really kind of it kind of opens up the door of the fact that I know that these laws are, great, man. James Madison was like, hey, man, these 10 are perfect. I'm a genius, but I need to keep things open. I know humanity will evolve, so I'm going to keep things open, and that way I'm going to keep things open is the Ninth Amendment. Great idea. Great idea. And the 10th Amendment is the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states or reserved to the states respectively or to the people. This is basically establishing the difference between federal powers and state powers, and I know we've heard of it. In terms of the federal powers, it says in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, that these enumerated powers include, among other things, the power to levy taxes, regulate commerce, establish a uniform law of naturalization, establish federal courts, to establish and maintain a military and declare war. Now, the question is the 10th Amendment being held up in current American society? Because as of right now, the argument can be made that the federal government is expanding their powers into other situations, into other things, right? Anything that is not included in the things that I just mentioned, and there's probably other kind of straight powers of the federal government that I have not indicated here, but this is kind of like a good list for you, is supposed to be powers that the state government has exclusively, right? So anything that is not here is something for a state government to decide amongst its own people. But the question with the federal government lately, and it's very interesting conversation too, right? In terms of how much power the federal government should have. 10th Amendment says, hey, you better not step out of line, but they've been kind of definitely towing the line. They're towing the line. And it's curious, it's interesting that a lot of people on the left kind of want the federal government to have more power and to make more laws in behalf of certain freedoms and all that stuff, right? But the question is, should they be allowed to do this? And the constant back and forth with stuff like abortion, for example, with like the police, for example, even with like gun control, for example, marijuana, for example. In those situations, there's always kind of like a what's the word? A kind of, I don't know I'm thinking of the word, but I can't spit it out. But it's a kind of a plea to the federal government to expand its powers and make federal proclamations across the entire country, even though the 10th Amendment says, hey, you can't do that. And I'll give credit on the people on the right, because a lot of them do say, like, hey, man, we got to establish every state should have their own way to do things. You feel me? That if you want to vote, you better vote at the state level. And I do think the importance of voting at the state level should be definitely emphasized way more, and not kind of like, we focus so much on the federal election and federal and presidents and stuff like that, but the state government, state laws, all that stuff should definitely be, honestly, a primary focus for people at the end of the day. So it's interesting. Is the federal government kind of pushing its boundaries? Even the conversation with social media and trying to influence social media is also a thing. So something to consider, even with the TikTok thing, with they brought TikTok up. They kind of, try to kind of pressure the CEO of TikTok. And some states should have the right. It should never be a federal law that they can ban TikTok. That really shouldn't be in their power. But if a state wants to ban TikTok, they can. I believe Montana is considering banning TikTok. So if a state wants to do it, they can. They shouldn't. I actually kind of like TikTok. I know you think that the Chinese are spying on us, and they might be. But as long as it's not, as long as you don't have like TikTok in like a federal government situation, and like you really shouldn't even have TikTok on like a federal computer or a phone that was given to you by the government. You shouldn't have TikTok on that anyway. But I'm just saying, you feel me? So that's just my opinion regarding that. So those are the 10 amendments. Those are our Bill of Rights, ladies and gentlemen. And now, as we wrap up the show, I'm going to rank the 10 amendments on my personal preference, what I think are the best amendments versus the worst amendments. They're all good amendments, they're all great amendments, they're all important amendments, but I'm just ranking them. So, with that said, number 10 ranked Bill of Right, the worst Bill of Right, is honestly the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment should be one of the top ones, but it seems like people in the government, especially the federal government, are kind of ignoring it. So I can't give credence to an amendment that is losing its value nowadays. So that's why it's number 10. Number 9, I gave the Third Amendment, not because it's very important. I do not want some military personnel just coming in my house whenever they want. But it's just not as important as other amendments because we don't really have an issue with this in our country. Number 8 is the Seventh Amendment, I believe. Yeah, the Seventh Amendment is basically the one that kind of indicates what a kind of civil situation versus a criminal situation is. Very simple, very standard, all important, but not as important, I believe, in comparison to some of the other amendments. They're all important, by the way. Just because I say it's not as important doesn't mean it's not important. I don't know why I have to say that, but I feel like I do, because some of y'all are very emotional. I'm just saying. I believe I'm doing number 7. Number 7 will be Eighth Amendment. Excessive, important, but for me individually, I plan to never be a criminal, so not as important to me, but still important for people who are getting charged and all that stuff. You don't want them to get in trouble for excessive punishment for very petty crimes or even like average crimes. They don't deserve, no time do they deserve excessive punishment, right? Pretty simple. Number 6, I gave the Sixth Amendment. So the Sixth Amendment, just kind of recap over that, is the right to a speedy and public trial. So basically, this is the rights of a criminal defendant. So again, very important. I plan to never be in that situation. Cross my fingers. I just got to be on my P's and Q's, ladies and gentlemen. Every one of us has to be on our P's and Q's. I'm just saying. Number 5, this is going to be controversial. My number 5 amendment is the Second Amendment. Now, I know some people have like the Second Amendment number 1. Like, I know who those people are. They're definitely gun advocates. I like guns and all that stuff. I think guns are cool. I don't think anybody should take all our guns. But at the end of the day, the amount of credence that people have to having a gun, just having a whole arsenal in their basement, I mean, it's overblown. Sure, especially if you live in a dangerous area where criminals can take a gun, right? You want to be armed and you want to be ready. But the amount of people who go like, everybody should have a gun, everybody should have a gun, they should be able to have a gun in public, they should be able to shoot anybody they want, because we have the right to bear arms, So I don't think it's not nearly as, important as people believe it should be, in terms of like everybody having a gun and the need to, you know, keep your gun in every situation. I don't think people need to have their gun publicly in every circumstance. Like, I saw a picture of someone who went in a restaurant and he had an AR in his back. Like, I'm like, bro, it's not that serious, bro. Why are you having an AR in your back, bro? What are you doing? Like, I don't want my kids to walk around and see people with fucking pistols in their holster. I don't want to see that. Now, do I want to have my guns? Oh, of course, of course. You come in my house, I'm about to blick, blick, boop. But at the end of the day, why are people just carrying ARs around? Like, what are we doing? What are we doing? Come on now. Number 4 is the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment, I believe, is the search and seizure, unwarranted, warrants and all that stuff. So, not allowing people to just not allowing cops and the government and officials to just come in your home and do whatever they want, to come in your car and do whatever they want, to just kind of like take advantage of you, right? So this gives you an important right to keep cops at bay. Keep cops at bay. Number three is the Fifth Amendment. I like the Fifth Amendment. This is all the important stuff you need to know when you're on trial, and this is important. So you don't want to this you don't want to know these things. You don't want the government taking advantage of you. Number two, this might surprise some people. The Ninth Amendment. The importance of the Ninth Amendment is extremely valuable to the Constitution from when it was originally created to 2023. The ability to understand that, hey, there are more rights in here that I didn't write down that you need to consider. It's so valuable, it's so important, and I think this was a crux on, constantly evolving the Constitution. And this gives us the ability to constantly evolve the Constitution. So, very important. And number one, is there any question? The First Amendment is number one. Like, come on now. The freedom to say what I don't want any government saying I can't say whatever I want. You feel me? So this is an important amendment. So these are the 10 Bill of Rights. Those are my rankings. Kind of go over it one more time. So these are my top 10, these are my rankings for the 10 amendments, the 10 Bill of Rights, from worst to best. They're all great. They're all good. Don't worry. Number 10, the 10th Amendment, basically indicating the differences between federal and state powers. Number 9, the Third Amendment, not making sure that the military can stay in your home. Number 8, the 7th Amendment, basically indicating the difference between a civil case versus a criminal case. Number 7, the 8th Amendment, excessive bail for criminals, excessive torture, all that stuff. Number 6, the Sixth Amendment, which is basically the rights of a criminal defendant, right to a speedy trial, right to a fair jury, all that stuff. Number 5, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. I think it's overrated. Number 4, Fourth Amendment, which is the right of search and seizure, not letting cops do whatever they want. Number 3, the Fifth Amendment, so all your rights in a trial. Number 2, the Ninth Amendment, basically saying there's more rights in the Constitution than is indicated in the Constitution. And number 1, the First Amendment. Pretty standard. Come on. So that is all we got for today's episode. I think it was a great episode and kind of going over the Bill of Rights. We will be back next Monday. Of course, like I said, leave a review. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And of course, you can leave a review on my website, www.thetrendwithrtlfaith.com. Hope you guys enjoyed today's episode of the podcast. You all have a good one. Take care and peace.